All right, my clock says 12 noon Eastern, so if, oh, I apologize, Windows decided to throw something up there. But I think we're ready to get going. So thank you everybody for joining me today with our Alteryx Designer webinar. Today's webinar is going to be focusing on data blending, or how do you combine your business data together in meaningful ways in order to enhance your analysis. As we get started here, I want to let everybody know that we have some Alteryx experts on the line in the Q&A area, and they're set up as panelists, so that if at any time during the webinar, if you have questions about the designer, about the things that we're discussing here in this webinar, feel free to type in the um, question in the Q&A, and our guys will address those questions. And also, we'll try to have a short Q&A at the end of this time frame. Now, I also want to remind everybody that this is being recorded, so if you want a recording afterwards, I believe that they are automatically sent out to everyone. So you'll be able to review it at your leisure. And so a little bit more about me. My name is Robert Fraire. That's my picture there on the screen. And I've been with Data Meaning for several years and am certified in Alteryx Designer Core and Advanced, and also partner certified. And so I've spent a lot of time in the IT area. I'm a database designer and SQL jockey in my background. So spent a lot of years working with data, and I think that for those of you getting started with Alteryx, I think you'll find that the Alteryx Designer tool is very nice and really logical in the way that it accomplishes things. Now, Data Meaning, the company that I work for, want to make sure to mention that we are an Alteryx premier partner, and so we work with the Alteryx employees, their Alteryx personnel, to help bring solutions to various companies. And so we provide enablement training, as well as experts to work on actual SOW projects that you might have if you have something you're trying to accomplish, and you want to use Alteryx to accomplish that. So without further ado, then we will get started. Today's webinar is the second in our series of 5 webinars on Designer. Last week we talked about the Alteryx Designer interface and the basics of how you put together an Alteryx workflow. Today we are talking about blending data sets, or as I said earlier, about combining the data in a meaningful way to help enhance the analysis that we can do on our data. So the agenda today is we're going to be going through this introduction, then we're going to be looking at data blending. It's really a simple agenda. We're going to focus on these particular tools: join, union, append, find, replace, and join multiple. So the way that I'm going to handle this today is we're going to go ahead and I'm going to explain a little bit about the tool itself, the join tool, the union tool, and then I'm going to show you through some slides what are the functionality from an Excel perspective, what is happening when you use this particular tool. And then we're going to go into Alteryx Designer, and I will build some simple workflows using those particular tools. And then at the end, I'll put together a little bit more complex workflow where we'll integrate what we've learned here as far as these blending tools into our workflow. And that'll be our webinar for today. All right. So we're looking at data blending. And so for first, let's talk about the different tools. So the first tool again is going to be the join tool. Now the join tool is where you are combining your data sets together, two data sets together based on a common key, or and so that's what a join does. Really, when you're thinking about joins, you're talking about the common key is really the whole basis of this tool, where you want to combine the various columns that you have in two different data sets together wherever that common key is shown. And I'm gonna show you an example of that in a little bit. We also have the union tool, which is different than the join, in that what a union is doing is you're stacking like data sets on top of each other. So whereas the join tool, oftentimes you're seeing more columns, but not necessarily more rows. With the union tool, you're really going to be seeing more rows as you stack your data one on top of each other. The append fields, this is a unique tool and very powerful. So what it does is it allows you to take a particular uh, value and disperse it amongst the entire other data set that you have. For instance, we're going to look at if you calculate a grand total, let's say a sales grand total, and you want to put that in every line of your analysis, you can use the append fields tool to accomplish that. The next one is find replace. We've all, I'm sure, manually worked on, Word document or an Excel worksheet where you're looking for values of a certain type and you want to replace it with a different value. Well, Alteryx gives you the ability to set this up once, and then every time you get a new data set in, it will go ahead and replace all the types of values that you are looking for without you having to go and run a find replace in Excel, or use the substitute function or replace function. You don't have to do those things. You can simply set up the find replace. And also, one of the things I like about the find replace, and we'll look at it a little bit, is it gives you the ability to do multiple different finds and replaces at the same time. You don't have to do them just one at a time. And then finally, we're going to look at the join multiple tool. The join multiple tool, whereas the join tool focuses on connecting two data sets together, the join multiple allows you to use multiple data sets along a common key. Now, there's some pluses and minuses to both of these, but they each have their individual purposes. And so I'll show you an example of using the join multiple as well. All right, so let's just take a quick look at the join tool. So in this case, if I've got these two layouts of data in Excel, right? I've got some customer data and I've got transaction data. Now, with this customer data, one of the things I notice is, and I've highlighted in yellow here, is that I've got customer IDs. So that's telling me that this customer with an ID of 2, this is his or her name is Gene Smith, and this is where they live. So this is some personal information about that customer. Then down here in the transaction table, what it has these customer IDs as well, highlighted in yellow. And what you'll see here is that then we find out what kind of purchases this particular customer made. So it is a very common thing that one would do with these two types of data sets, is you want to combine them together, because maybe you want to find out on sales, how much of the sales came from the city of Denver, or how much of the sales came from the state of Colorado. Things like that. You can do that by first joining these two tables together, and in this case, based on this common key. Now, if we were to do this in Alteryx and we joined based on the customer ID column, one of the things that we would find is that when we connected our data sets together on this customer ID, we would end up with a result set. If I kept all the columns, I would end up with a result set that first showed me all my rows from my first data set. Then it'll show me all my rows and columns from my second data set. And what I want to point out here is that even though in the customer ID there was only one, in the customer table, there was only one entry for customer ID 3, because that same customer had made multiple transactions, then in the result of this join, we're going to see those multiple rows showing up. So we see this data repeated in our join based on this customer ID joining process. So that's the join tool, and again, we're gonna see it in action in Alteryx here in just a minute. And then following this, we'll look at the union tool. So the union tool then is if we have data, so in this case, these we've got the same column names, we've got employee names, job titles, base pay, and the difference between these data sets is these are for different years. So we've got year 2011, we got year 2012, we have year 2013. What the union allows you to do is, instead of having two separate data sets each by year, you would end up with one data set. And with one data set, you would then have the rows for 2011 and the rows for 2012 all together in one data set. That way, if you want to track people over various years, you'll be able to do that from one data set. Another thing I want to point out here about the union tool is that there are going to be two options of the union tool, which is looking at things by the name. And if you say by the name, then you have to make sure that you have an exact match in the names. Because if we look closely at our second and third data set here, what we'll see is that job title here is 2 words. But job title in this third data set has the underscore in between it. So if we try to match these up based on the name, Alteryx is going to say this column is not the same as this column, and it's going to end up creating an additional column for job underscore title, and then we'll have probably not what we're looking for. So another way of doing this is by position. So if we say we want the first columns to match, second columns to match, third columns to match, etc., we can also do it in that order. Next is the append field. This is where I was talking about, where if we have a total sales number, and here I see that I have sales by my region and my state, what I could do is, if I want to have this total on to this data set, I can use the append fields tool, and what it'll do is it then will take this one value and it'll apply it to every row in my first data set. So again, this is a use case that is very common, but you do have to be careful with the append, because let's say if I had 100 rows, or let's say I had 10 rows in my total sales column here. If I did that and I joined it with, or I used the append field with this data set here, what it would do is for every one of these rows, it would add each of the rows that are in our total sales. So if you have 10 rows to start with and you append 10 rows to it, you end up with 100 rows in your result set. So if you're not careful, your data can build exponentially, and you end up with memory issues, and usually that kind of data is not what you're looking for. So you want to be careful when you use the append fields tool. It works good for 1 row, maybe 2 rows, but if you're seeing that you have a lot of different rows that you want to bring together with an existing data set, you might want to go back and evaluate if this is the right tool for your needs. All right, then we've got the find and replace tool. So this is the idea if, let's say we have these different account holders and we've got this ampersand here and we've got CO right there. But what we want to do is we want to take everywhere we have this ampersand and replace it with the word and. Or if we see the CO, we want it to be changed to company, and etc. down this line. What you can use the find and replace tool for is you set it up, and then instead of having these values, you will have changed values instead. So I wanted to highlight the first couple. Oh, so I made a little bit of a mistake there, but these and co are changed to be and company. Those are the places where those changes are made, and those changes are made throughout the entire data set. So this is nice because for every row that you have in your replacement data set, it's going to go ahead and make all of those changes at the same time, as opposed to if I was trying to do this manually using a find and replace in Excel. I would end up having to run multiple instances of this find and replace in order to make all the changes that I want. All right, and then the multi-join, which is where we have more than two data sets that we're combining together. In this case, if we look along the top, we have name columns, and they're common between all three of my data sets. So if I were to use the multi-join on these three data sets, what I end up with is one combined data set with all of the columns that are from each of the individual data sets are all in here. Now, one of the things you might notice is there's a line here that's null in a couple of the areas. What this is telling me is that this person, Christina Combe, she exists in this second table, but doesn't exist in either the first or the third. So her value from this data set gets included, but you end up with nulls in the other data sets because the name isn't there. I can see here, this is Christina Kim, but this one is Christina Combe. And so that's why you don't see any values for the first table or the third table in our multi-join that we have here. All right, so that's enough of the PowerPoint. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like in Alteryx. All right, that's all my Zoom stuff, move that stuff out of the way. All right, so here we have our Alteryx designer. And if you remember from last week, or if you've been using Alteryx for a little bit, this white area here in the middle is our canvas where we're actually going to build our workflows. So let's start off with the join. So here I've got two tables that are close to what we talked about in the PowerPoint. I've got a customer table and I've got a customer transaction table. So what I want to do is I want to combine these two data sets together. Now this is where I would go up here to my tool palettes and I would select the join tool palette, or tab if you want to. If you don't like to use the word palette, you can call it the join tab. And in here, you'll see the various tools that we were just talking about. So in this case, I want to use the join tool. So I'm going to click on the join tool and drag it down onto my canvas. And I'm going to set it over here on my workflow canvas. Now, whenever you bring in a tool like this, if we look initially on the left here, we'll see in the configuration window that there aren't any common column or keys set up because we haven't connected any data to it. So in this case, I'm going to click on the open anchor or the output anchor of my customer table, and I'm going to bring this into the L input anchor of my join. All right, in this case, the L stands for left. And so now when I look at my configuration window, you'll see here on the left, it has all the columns that were available in my table are now present there that I could choose as being my common key. So then I'm going to do the same process here with my customer transaction table. I'm going to drag this and drop it on the right input anchor. All right, so now between these two, I've got two data sets coming in. Now, from my configuration window of my join tool, I have to select which is the column that I'm going to use that's in common between these two data sets. So if I look here, my customer table is keyed by customer ID. So that's what I believe I'm going to use. Now on the right hand side, there is an ID column, but I have to be careful because since this is a transaction table, the ID column is not the customer ID, but the transaction ID. So I have to come down here a little bit, and then I see that the customer ID column is present in this table. So I want to select that column as well. All right, so now that I have customer ID from the left table, going to be joined with the customer ID of the right table. Now, the second part that I want to show you before I run this is that this down here is what we call an embedded select capability, because what it does is it allows us to choose which columns from each of the tables that we're joining together, what columns do we need? Well, it all would depend on the business case. In our case, what I know right off the top is I have customer ID over here from this table. I really don't need to include the customer ID from my transaction table as well, because that's going to be the exact same value on each row. Because since we're joining them together based on customer ID, if I were to bring in both of those, they would be the same exact value. So since I don't want to include this, I can come over to this column, which has the right input, and customer ID is the name of the column. I'm going to uncheck that column. That way, it will not include this customer ID column in my results set. Now, I'm going to come up here to my in-out palette and bring in the browse tool, and I'm going to connect my browse tool to my join or my J output. I'll describe to you what the L and the R are in a minute. So in this case, I'm going to run this workflow, and what you'll see is I had 2,000 customers, 2,678 customers. I had over 9,000 transactions, and then when I bring these together, what I end up with is 9,343 records that have been joined together. And when I look at their data set, the output, I can see that I've got my customer ID and all my information that's specific to my actual customer. And then over here, you can see that I have my transaction IDs as well. So now it's got every row that is tied together with that particular customer ID is shown here one at a time. So for customer ID 10, I've got the rest of that data joined, and then I've got 1,000, 2,000, all the rest of here. We can see that some of these are multiplied, and because there were multiple transactions for this particular customer ID. So just like we saw in our PowerPoint slide, we get back multiple rows, so that in this case, in our join, the transaction table was the one that had the most entries for customer ID. So while we had 9,400 transactions coming in, we ended up with 9,343 rows coming out. Now that's an interesting number. These numbers aren't exactly the same, 9,426 and 9,343. So what happened to the other transaction rows? Well, that's what the flexibility of this join tool helps us in that case, because what we can do is if we can come down here to our result window and we can click on the R output. And what we'll see from our R output is that there were 83 records that were not joined with any customer data. Now, from a business point of view, this seems kind of strange to me, right? How can I have transactions associated with particular customers that aren't in the customer table? So maybe that's something that I need to inform somebody of. So that's one thing that I can do is I can get these rows out from my list here, and I can send some information to somebody. So let's just say I wanted to send an email to the owner of this transaction table, and I can connect that here and fill in the rest of this information. I'm not going to do that at this time, but I could fill in the rest of this information and be able to send them an email with the customers that show up in my transaction table that did not appear in my customer table. So that's something that you can do within Alteryx. Now, I want to explain since we're looking at the fact that we have these 83 rows that have transactions without corresponding customers. One of the things that is common in our business use of a join is that perhaps what's most important to us are these transactions, because with these transactions are tied things such as our sales. Our total sales value is caught up in our transaction numbers here. So if I were to drop 83 rows, I would be losing some of my sales in this instance. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I include all of my sales, even though I don't have all the customer information set up right. So what I want to do is I want to do what's in SQL terms we call an outer join. In Alteryx, what we can see is that these pictures that are here on the configuration window will give you the idea. Out of the J output anchor, we will see the intersection of the two tables. So everywhere where there was a common customer ID will come out in this J section. Then on the R output anchor, we will find all the transactions that didn't have a corresponding customer ID. So in this case, I still want to keep all my transactions even though they didn't have a customer ID. So I want both the joined columns or rows, sorry, and the transaction only rows. So in order to do that within Alteryx, what I can do is I can grab my union tool here. I'm going to bring it into my workflow, and then I'm going to grab the right output anchor and bring it into my union as well. That way now I have both my joined rows and my transaction only rows. So if I were to run this again, what I would see is now I'm back to my 9,426 rows, which are all the transaction rows that I started out with, the 9,426, by doing this, what I would call a right outer join, or combining the data sets from the join and the transaction only into one data set. I was able to maintain the integrity of my transaction rows by having both sets combined into one data set. All right, so that's our join. I see a little activity there on the Q&A, so keep it up, ask your questions, and we can continue to get answers that way. All right, now I'm going to move over to the union, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the union tool. So in this case, as we saw in the last example, I can bring in my union, and I can then connect my data sets to the union. Now in this case, I know my data pretty well. So if I know I have two different years of data, if I'm looking at my union tool, the first option is to auto configure by name. So in this case, as I was pointing out in the slides, what's going to happen is it's going to look for this exact name, employee name, job title, with a space in between, other pay with a space there. All of that is taken care of, or those are the exact names. Now, in my second table, it looks like I have the exact same things. So if I put a browse tool at the end of this and I run it for these two data sets, actually, let me change something real quick. I'm actually going to say I want to see the connection progress. I'm going to just leave this to go show because I want to see those number of columns each time. All right, so in this case, I've got 36,159 and 36,766 from each of these tables. When I look at my answer set, I have the exact sum of the two individual data sets, which is 72,925. Now, another thing that I can look at is when I look at my output, I see that I have 11 fields, and fields is another name for columns. So whether you think of them as columns or fields, it's the same thing. So 11 fields. So did all of my columns from my input data sets show up in my output data sets? So I look back here and I can see that I've got 11 fields in my 2011 and I've got 11 fields in my 2012. So it did, all the column names did match up, and I was able to get exactly what I was looking for, a stacking of one set of files over the other. All right, but if I grab my 2013 data and I bring it in here, we're going to see something different. When I run this now I've got 110,000 rows, which is exactly the sum of these three together. But here's the difference. When I look at how many columns or fields do I have, you can see here that it says that I have 20. Even though I had 11 columns in my input and let me grab that here, 11 columns in the input for each of these, somehow I ended up with 20 columns in the output. So what happened? Well, one of the things that we can tell here is if I look here at my year, I can see that I have these other columns called employee underscore name, job underscore title, base underscore pay. And if I scroll down, I would find out that, these are actually populated when the year is 2013. So what happened is because San Francisco for 2013, these column titles were a little different than the other ones that were included. What the union tool did, since I was auto configuring by name, is it moved all those columns that didn't match exactly over into additional columns. So now only two of the columns actually matched and the rest of them were slid over to the side. So that's not what I was looking for. So in this case, I know that the order of the columns is the same. So I can take my union tool and I can come over here and choose auto configure by position instead. And when I do that and I run, what I will find out is I still have all my rows, 110,000, but this time when I click on my browse, you'll see that now I only have 11 fields, because what Alteryx did this time is since employee name and employee underscore name were the first column, it put in all the data for 2011, 2012, and 2013. It matched them up line for line, column for column. All right, so the third scenario though is what happens if you have different names and they're not in the same order. Well, in this case, we don't have that case, but I can come down here and I can select a third option, which is the manually configure fields. And what we'll see here is then it'll lay out by name what it's going to do. and I can see here that, aha, year and notes matched, but it was going to put employee name out as its own separate column. So if I wanted to line it up with one of the other columns, I could use these arrows and I could move it over here, and now the employee underscore name will match up right below the rest of these. So I'm not going to go through this whole process, but you could do that to every column. And sometimes you have data sets where the columns, the data in the column is the same. It is relevant to be in the same column, but they have different names altogether. So using this option, you can actually match up your data as you would want it to be. So those are the options that we have. I'm going to take this back to position, and this is the union tool. All right, now make sure on the chat here how we're doing. All right, it looks like we're doing fine out there. Okay, so next tool I wanted to look at then was the Append tool. So in this case, I created a small spreadsheet, and I've got some data in here. I've got some data. I've got region. I've got a particular state. So I've got New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont are in the Northeast. I got Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina in the South, etc. And here are their sales. Now, from this spreadsheet, I also had the total. I had come over here and I had done a sum of these underneath, and I had gotten a column total. Now I want to bring that data into Alteryx, and I need that data to be side by side. So I did, don't worry about this guy. I just said choose the first 9 rows because I didn't want to bring in that total as a new row. I want to put it as a new column. So in this case, when I look at my data, I just have my initial data coming in, and then I've got my one row with my totals. So if I grab my Append Fields tool and I bring it in here and I connect my data, this is my main set of data, my 9 different areas in the sales by those areas. Then I bring in my one row that has my totals in it. All right. Now, in the Append Fields tool, you can also select what columns you want to bring coming out. And also, like right here, I don't want this column to be called F1. So I can come over here and I can rename this one. This is going to be my total sales column. All right, then I'm going to right click and put a browse tool after that. I'll run this here. And when I run this here, we'll see that I still have 9 rows because that's what I had before. But this time, if we look down here in the result window, I have the total sales as well. So coming back here and looking at the Append tool, coming into the tool, I have the region, state, and the sales. Then coming out of the tool, I have those same 9 rows with the additional column of the total sales. All right, so that allows us to then do calculations. I could bring in a formula tool and say, hey, how much of my sales, what percentage of my sales came from New York? I could then create another column with a percent contribution sales. And we're going to look at that a little bit later. All right, then I want to show you the replace function, which is, in this case, on the replace, we have that same data set I was looking at, right? We've got these count holders, we've got the ampersand and CO, and I want to change them. And so I've got another data set here where I'm saying what I want to change it into. All right, so then if we go ahead and we grab our Find Replace tool, we connect it, and then I connect into the R input what I want to replace, right? So I've got my F, which is my find. So these are the columns that it's going to look at to find, or this is the data set that we're going to find a particular column's values. And then this R is the replace, the column we choose from this input, we're going to replace the values with what we have here in our second. All right, so now I need to configure my find and replace tool. So in there, I've got three options that are available up top here. I can say I'm looking for something where it starts with the value that's in my replacement table, or any part will mean if it's any text anywhere inside it, or if I have to have a one-to-one match. Those are my three different options here. So in this case, I'm going to say any part of field. Now this is something I often overlook myself. You actually have to make sure that you have the field that you're looking for. So in our case, we've got the account holder is the one that we wanted, right? So yeah, we had different columns coming in. We had a double and a date, but it's the string column that we're able to use as what we're going to do our find in. All right, so we've got that string column selected. Now we're going to match up, we're going to look for in this column the values that come from the word column in my replacement set. So if I come back here and look at this again, my word column has this ampersand, CO, CMPY, etc. And that's what it's going to search for in the account holder column of my original data set. And it's going to then, I have a couple of options here. I can say replace that text. So if I want to go in and actually modify that column, I can click on this radio button and select that I want to replace it with the values that are in the replacement column. All right, and then also here it's got an option for replace multiple found items. So in what that'll do is if you have that same, let's say ampersand shows up a couple of times in your string, it will go ahead and make the change each of those times it finds it. Now, so that's what the option here. Otherwise, what you also could do is you could just append, let's say we could append the replacement value in another column instead of replacing where it's found in the text. So in this case, we're going to replace it. Another thing that's important to look at is match whole word only, because one of the replacements we have is that CO. Well, CO, changing it for company, is good when we've got a standalone CO. But what if we have the letter CO showing up inside of another word that's in our string? We don't want to replace that. So we can click on the match whole word only. So that way it'll make sure that we don't replace parts of a word. And then the case insensitive find, if we want to make sure if we have some uppercase and other lowercase, we can make sure that it's not going to miss that find because the case is different. All right, so this is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to bring in my browse tool and I'm going to run this. And what we find here is that we have now it's taken that ampersand, it's replaced it with and. The CO, it's replaced it with company. We can see company, company down through our entire data set. You can see here I've got Colorado still. It didn't replace CO for Colorado. So that's good. And it's made those changes for me. And I don't have to go through and do multiple steps to get all of those things changed. I just have to use the find and replace tool once. All right, then we've got the multi-join. This is the last of the individual tools we're gonna talk about. Now the multi-join, it's very much like the join tool, but it has some particular features. One is very importantly is you can join multiple data sets together at the same time. Whereas the join tool, if you remember, is limited because it has two input anchors. It can only bring in two at a time. All right, so that's one big difference. You still have the ability in the multi-join, you can join by specific field name, but here's the deal. If you are bringing in these three tables, they need to all be able to join on the same common key. It doesn't have to have the exact name of the column. You can select the column that's in here. But what happens many times is we might, when we're doing a join, I join these two on customer ID. I might bring in another table and join again based on state information. Well, trying to join the data sets together on state is a different key than joining on customer ID before. So in that case, we would have to do two join tools to get those connected together. But in the multi-join, if you have a common key across all your data sets, you can bring them in together. And what it's going to do by default here is it's going to bring in all my rows, whether they joined or not with the others. So when I look at that, and I've got when I run this here, what we'll see is I had 10 rows, 10 rows, 10 rows, and when I bring it out, I've got these 10 rows, but what we can see is that not everything matched all the way across. So what we can do is it'll join everything where the names match. If the names don't match, then it won't join them together. Actually, my data set here is a little bit different than I thought. It has the name correctly right here in this Christina value here. So if any of these names didn't match, it would show up. It wouldn't show up as having joined. It would show it with nulls for the other tables. Now, one of the things you can do is, as an option, is you can also say, I only want to output the records that join from all inputs. So that would be, if you want to make sure I only want to get the rows where everything joined together, you select that option here. And again, like some of our other tools, we have an embedded select statement, so we can say, you know what, I don't need the name 3 times because that's the names what I joined on. I'm going to get rid of that name. I'm going to get rid of that name, and now it's sort of streamlined my data set. All right, so we've got each of the join, union, append, replace, and the multi-join. All right, it looks like we have some time left here, so I'm going to walk through a quick usage of these tools in a workflow. So in this case, I've got these two tables. They're familiar to us. These are our customer tools, our tables. So I'm going to bring in my join, just like we did earlier. I'm going to bring these two together. I'm going to select customer ID as my join. Now in this case, you know, I know kind of what I want. So I don't need all of these columns to come out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect all of the columns, and then I'm going to choose the things I want. So I'd say I want my product category, and I want my customer segment, I want my income, and I want my sales as well. All right, so those are the columns I want to bring in. And then I'm going to run this here, and I can see at this point in time, I've got my income and I got my sales. Now we remember from earlier, if I want to get all my sales, I need to bring in a union tool so I can grab my customer transaction. Oh, wait a minute, my customer transactions on the other side. So this time, excuse me, I want to bring the origin in to the left, because what I did here different than what I did before is my customer transactions is actually my left input. Earlier we used it on the right. So now my union I needed the transactions from the left and the join. All right, so I'm bringing those together. Now what I want to do is I've got a small problem when I do this, because I want to do a calculation, but right now I can see that all of my columns are string columns. So I'm going to use my auto field tool so that I can get some numeric columns out of here. All right, so now I've got some numeric columns. All right, now what if I wanted to calculate my sales by customer segment. What I can do is I can bring in my summarize tool. I'm going to grab my customer segment. I'm going to group by that. And then I'm going to grab my sales here. And I'm going to do a sum of the sales. All right. So when I do that and I run this, what I will find out is now I have my different consumer segments, and my sum of sales. Now, interestingly enough, I've got this null in one of my columns because this one are the 83 rows that I didn't have any customer with, so it had no customer segment to join it with. So I'm going to do a little bit of modification here. I'm going to grab my formula tool and I'm going to say, you know what? I want to update my customer segment column. I'm going to say if is null the customer segment. All right. If that's true, then I want to make the value in this column to be no segment. All right. And then else I want it to be the customer segment. I want to leave it alone. And then I'm going to put in end if. All right, so if I do that and I run this again, what we'll find is that now I have my all my segments, including my no segment value in here. All right, now if I want the percent, I'm going to do one more thing, which is I want the percent contribution that goes with these sales. So I'm going to use another transform tool. I'm going to bring this in together, and this time I'm only going to sum up my sales. So I've got my sales column. I'm going to sum that up. That's going to give me one value, right? So now I've got my one value. I've got all my segment values. Now, if you guys remember, we can use the Append Fields tool to bring my sales together with my segment sales. And then I'll use my formula tool to do a calculation, right? So I'm going to run this so we've got everything showing up here. All right, so now I'm going to make sure what my column is named, sum of sales. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to rename this one because this will get me confused. I'm going to make this one total sales. So to differentiate it from sum of sales. Now, in here, I'm going to create a final one. I'm going to say percent contribution. And here, I'm going to put in, I want the sum of sales divided by the total sales. And this is going to be a number. All right. And then we'll put in a browse tool here. All right, so finally we can see here at the end, we've got our percent contribution number and for each of the segments. So I see that I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to actually do one more thing because one of the things people want to know is, well, this number doesn't really look like a percent, so I'm going to do one last formula here. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to take my percent contribution. Actually, I'm going to make a new column. I'll call it format contribution. And here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a function called toString. I'm going to put in my percent contribution. And then my number of decimal places is going to be 2. And then I'm going to take that, I'm going to multiply it by 100. All right. Actually, I got to do that inside here. Sorry. Let me bring that in here. All right. And then I'm going to add a percent sign to the end of it. Okay. So now when I run this, I will end up with a column here that's 20.11%, 36%, etc. for each of these values. So I hope that you've seen how valuable we've got our join, our union, and our append in this one fairly short workflow. We've been able to use each of those tools to help us combine and enhance our analysis. So that really ends the presentation today. Is there any questions that you have before we end this session? I know that some questions have been asked in the Q&A and have been answered. Any final questions before we leave? All right. I thank you all for being with us here today, and I hope that you are able to make it back next week when we start looking at more into data parsing, when we're going to be talking about how do we clean up our data sets in a way that makes it useful in Alteryx or in let's say Power BI to actually present our data. How can we do that in an automated fashion using Alteryx Designer? All right, so thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to give you back 3 minutes unless there are any final questions. All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon or late morning for anybody on the West Coast. Thank you very much, and have a good day.